Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you guys that are in the chat function, sharing where you're from. It's great to see so many Kentucky folks, but other folks from around the country. I see Oklahoma. I see the Jersey Shore, lots of cool places that folks are doing good work in rural America. I'm Dreama Gentry, and today I'm joined by Bob Balfanz from the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins. Hey, Bob, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Look forward to it.
Great to have you. One of the things that I've been hearing continually as I talk to practitioners is how do we prepare for schools to reopen this fall? How do we continue to support young people on their college journey? And so today we're going to really dig into that. Bob's going to talk with us about early warning systems and how they can be utilized in the wake of COVID-19. We're also going to hear from a superintendent who's really working to prepare her district for reopening. So the flow of the day is we'll start off with Bob just introducing himself. We'll go to Dr. Andrea Kane, who's a superintendent from Maryland, from rural Maryland. Then Bob and I'll have a short conversation, and then we'll dig into an in-depth presentation around early warning systems. So Bob, let's start off. Just tell folks a little bit about yourself and the work you do.
Sure. My name is Bob Balfanz. I'm the director of the Everyone Graduates Center, which is at the School of Education at Johns Hopkins. And we're an applied R&D center, so we really try to take research to practice. And we're really focused on the question of what does it take to graduate all our students ready for college and career and actually help them with that transition so they succeed in post-secondary. And we're working on a large project right now called Pathways to Adult Success, which is really a collaborative effort of now 150 states and school districts and nonprofits, including Dreama and her team, and really trying to think, how can we use early warning systems to keep kids on track to college or career readiness? How can we give good navigation guidance to all kids to make the right choices? And how can we bring universities and K-12 systems together to build and career development opportunities to develop better and stronger pathways for our kids?
And I'm really excited that you're with us. I got to say, you've been one of those mentors that I've followed your work for years. And it's to actually get to know you, it's been great. Much of our Gear Up work, our Upward Bound work, all of our work here in Kentucky really is based on that early warning system and the ABCs and that research you've done. It's rare, I think, that we can find folks that really can take research and practice and blend them to make it practical for us practitioners. And so it's exciting to have you here. Before Bob and I start our conversation, I want to ground our discussion in a voice from the community. Our superintendents across the country, our principals, our school staff, our educators have all been working to plan for what does it look like in the fall when schools reopen and what does reopening mean. I had a chance to meet with Dr. Andrea Kane. She's the superintendent of Queens Anne County Public School District in Maryland. It's a rural school district there on the Chesapeake Bay. And, you know, it really does sort of, you know, make me sort of stretch my boundaries to think of Maryland. I think of Baltimore. I don't think about the Chesapeake Bay area. I don't think of the rural area. So learning about her place and a place where a large percentages of their students still do not have any kind of broadband access or can't get cell phone service. It was eye-opening. But I want to share with you a clip from the conversation where she talks about how she and her team are doing their planning work and some of the things that they're keeping top of mind. So if you'll bear with me, I'll share my screen. I did tell Bob, this is the most stressful part of this whole presentation for me, is figuring out how to share screens. Hold on.
So we are working right now on our recovery plan, our plan for reopening schools. And in fact, right now, as we speak, we have a proposed plan out to the community for public feedback. So we had 6 teams working on everything from transportation and health aspects to, you know, the physical space in buildings and how students would learn and that transition between the online portion of learning and the face-to-face learning, how we would continue learning over the summer, given the fact that students will have gaps in their learning from the school closures, even though most of our students students were online. So there are so many different phases to thinking about reopening. One of the biggest ones, honestly, is transportation and capacity. And what the CDC or the Maryland Health Department will say about how many people can be in a given area inside at one time. So we are constantly working toward, being flexible, number one, and trying to get as many face-to-face opportunities with our students as possible, because our community has spoken and our community wants children back in schools like ASAP. And I get it. I absolutely get it. So, those are some of the challenges. Transportation, if we can only put, 6 feet around each student on a bus, that's going to give 8 to 10 kids on a bus, and most of our students are transported by bus. So we're trying to work within the guidelines, but use a little creativity and be flexible where we can, so that we can get students and staff in our buildings in a safe way. And then once they are in the buildings, classrooms won't look exactly like they looked before the whole COVID-19 pandemic, because we still have to recognize that social distancing, from traffic in the hallways to cafeteria, and if children will eat in the cafeteria or eat in their classrooms, but still giving teachers that time to have their own, duty-free lunch. It's quite a bit of a challenge, but we're up to it just like everybody else is, and we'll do it. And our kids will be either in school or online, or some faction thereof. It could be some hybrid model, and that's probably what we're headed toward. But just so that we're prepared, so that if there's a resurgence and health officials say schools have to close, that we don't have the same situation that we had when schools closed this spring. We'd be prepared, and that transition would certainly be much more seamless than it was when it was an emergency, and we didn't see it coming. We actually have a team devoted exactly to that, because one, children have undergone, situations at home which we may never be fully aware of. Just having been isolated all by itself creates that issue, for some attention to be given to social emotional learning. But if children were in traumatic situations, parents not having their jobs and the income not being what it needed to be or what it once was, and the availability of food and the necessities, and some children have been misplaced, with their housing. Those are things that certainly impact learning. And, we're committed to addressing those things first when we get our children in front of us in the fall. So social emotional learning, those support groups, those personnel who are able to address the needs of children, whether they are at home or with us. And like I said, we'll probably have some hybrid model where we're doing both, some online learning and learning in the classroom. So between our counselors and our pupil personnel workers and our student services department, along with administrators and teachers, we will be focusing on that social emotional aspect immediately when students are in front of us again. Can tell you, one of the real benefits, I find of working in a small and a rural community is that families do stick together and they support each other. And our teachers live in the communities that they serve. So they are part of the community. They're part of the community and part of the school. So they serve that dual role. And a lot of our employees have children in our school district. And so they are committed, not just because it's their job, but they're committed, and they have a personal commitment when your children are involved. So it really does help. And we've got some great community agencies that support our families. We meet during the COVID crisis, we were meeting multiple times a week virtually. And then we sort of backed out to about, every once a week. but you know, there are groups of volunteers who will go and deliver food and, you know, make sure that kids are okay. We, in the beginning, you know, we couldn't put our hands on all of our students, identify where they were because of parents' working situations. So some parents were not essential workers, but they were working in areas where they couldn't just quit their job. And rather than leave young children at home, they had to put them with relatives or friends. And we had to do that work to find out where all of our children were. So we have that type of a community, and they are supportive, and they really want to work to make sure that everybody has what they need. They connect with other agencies, and sometimes those agencies are in other counties, and make sure that all of our students and our families have what they need.
And so I have to say that talking to Dr. Kane, so much of what she said resonated with our work in Appalachian Kentucky in rural places. So Bob, as she noted, in rural districts, we often benefit from having that real close relationship with the community. Are there ways that schools can leverage those relationships this fall?
I mean, absolutely. It is an area where I think rural areas have a leg up, because all the evidence and experience shows is that when you have strong student to teacher and student to family and teacher to family relationships, you're able to be much more nimble and have a much more sense of we're in this together and we're a team, as opposed to we're sort of all on our own. And for responding to crises like this, it's fundamental that we really lead with relationships, and we lead with a sense that we're in this together. We're going to support each other. We're not going to blame each other. That actually goes a long way to helping kids overcome some of the traumas they're facing, and some of the challenges, to know there's someone in their corner. And the same for the adults too, for the teachers to know they have members of the community in their corner, and for the members of the community to know the teachers are in their corner, helps everybody. So it's a real foundation to build upon, and something to make sure that, you know, it's there, but it may not be everywhere, and in places where it's not, to keep building it.
And I do appreciate you bringing up the educators. And I do think that much of the focus has been on preparing and supporting students as we enter into the fall semester or enter into this next year. But educators will also need to have support, because many of them are the stress they're dealing with, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, because they got to help teach their own kids. They got to teach other kids. They have to learn on the dime how to do everything differently. And there's a lot of just uncertainty of what the fall will bring.
Yeah, and the folks that are with us today and that will be listening to this webinar are primarily college access and success professionals, counselors, guidance counselors, educators in rural school districts. And so as you think about, and I know you're going to go into early warning systems in a bit, but as you think about how this group of folks can support educators and students, what's top of mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those folks have a real critical role to play, because they're the ones that can actually have the conversations with students, which are so important, right? Because as we heard from the superintendent, we'll talk about in a minute, we all experience COVID, but we experience it in different ways. And you can't, just by looking at somebody, you can't tell how they experienced it. And then I think, you know, we know from the literature that for kids to flourish in general, but in trying times, they need a sense of belonging, they need a sense of agency, and they need a sense of engagement. And really, all those folks you talked about are really the folks that can make that happen, give the kids a sense of, yes, we're in your corner. Yes, you have some power over your destiny. It's not totally taken out of your hands. And yes, you know, we'll have to find ways to keep you engaged, because as we know, and we're talking about this, you know, it's a fluctuating number, but some people put it around 20% of high school students have been basically disconnected from schooling when it was remote. And we know from adolescents that once you get disconnected, yes, you can come back, but the further you get disconnected, the longer the road to come back is. And so really to reach all kids when they come back and just check in with them and like make sure those connections are there, that is going to be really important.
And as Dr. Kane said, you know, their district is planning both for learning loss, but also that social emotional learning piece, that connection. And I know that you're going to dive into that with your presentation. So I think I'll just turn it over to you and let you walk us through that. And we can talk a bit Folks, if you have questions for Bob, you can type them in the chat. We'll try to get to them at the end, but if not, we'll try to get some resources and connections to your and answers to the questions afterward. So Bob, and I think Sam will help you with your slide deck.
Great, thank you. All right, so we're going to talk today about how we can use and adapt what are called often early warning, but in some places on track, in other places multi-tiered student support systems to support students during COVID. Next slide. And it's really going to be 3 parts. We're going to talk very briefly because we've already sort of covered it. Just what we know about the impact of COVID on students. And then how we can use early warning and on-track systems to support kids, and to do this, what do we have to do? Is really what we're going to cover in our presentation. So go to the next slide. We can begin. So as we know, right, that COVID impacts are going to continue through next year and beyond. We've heard from the superintendent and others. It's going to be some combination of in-person, remote, blended, in unpredictable ways. It might start one way and go another. And then we also know that many of our families and students are feeling economic impacts already, and it will continue. So we have to think about both these things, how the sort of virus itself is impacting and how sort of the implications of the virus through its economic impacts are impacting our kids. Next slide. We heard a number of these, and I won't go into depth, but just to remind ourselves that there's a whole range of ways COVID could negatively affect our students. Some will be true trauma. They've experienced death or illness among close friends or families because of COVID. We know, unfortunately, that there has been sort of a continuing and unable to notice child abuse going on, and that's a growing concern because if kids aren't there to be seen in school, they're not be able to be seen when this very unfortunate thing is occurring. Others are facing stress from food insecurity and financial troubles and environmental conditions. There's the fear of the unknown and the uncontrollable. Some are frustrated by this uninterrupted learning or the fact that they don't have internet, as we heard from the superintendent. Without broadband, right, it's hard to be connected and you could get really frustrated, or you have to share with your siblings and there's stress for when you get your time. And then we know is this 20% we've talked about, suddenly unattached from that supportive day-to-day interactions of schools. And we sometimes forget how important that is for so many kids, that yes, first and foremost, school is where they learn. But for many kids, first and foremost, school is also where they feel supported and connected and just attached to other adults. If we go to the next slide, it's also important to remember that some students may have had positive experiences coming out of COVID, right? We can't just conceptualize everything as negative and lost. Some of those students that have had to step up and themselves become sort of first responders, taking on food delivery services or finding a job to help support their family in doing that, or helping educate their siblings, actually have experienced the taste of true agency, really be able to make a difference and help other people. And that's a profound experience for all of us, but particularly for adolescents. And some of them may be like, and now I'm supposed to just go back and like learn algebra and not like do these powerful things to help people. I'm not so excited about that, right? I know I have to do it, but it's not so exciting. Some may have experienced this sense of community they didn't feel before, that we're all in this together and we're pulling together. Some kids have told us that they prefer the online learning and the distance learning. This is particularly for some kids that were feeling bullied at school or teased in different ways or didn't fit in. They now feel like they can learn and there's no stigma attached to it, like not being in school. And some may have just enjoyed the freedoms of a less regulated day, right? It's where we highly regulate our adolescence. There's a lot of developmental literature that says that's not the natural state for an adolescent to be highly regulated. And some are like, oh, this is great. So that's just the balance. Yes, there's going to be a lot of really serious stuff we have to deal with, but remember too that some kids may be coming to us with a different frame. And we don't want to cast everything as like recovery from loss, because for some kids, they found some benefits. All right, next slide. So what we know then is that the extent that there's lasting impacts on students is going to depend on two things. Their circumstances, how they experience the circumstances of COVID they went through, and how they experienced and processed them. And we know that, you know, two students can face similar circumstances, but experience and process them differently, right? A lot of the research on trauma, for example, and things like ACEs shows that yes, on average, if you have a high number of ACEs, you're gonna feel experiences from trauma. But some kids, in fact, don't, right? They experience those and they don't have the traumatic effects. So it's really about what you do and how you experience it. And there's a nice resource here that we'll link to it, give you a way to access at the end if you want to go deeper into that. So when we put that together on the next slide, that we have these positive and negative experiences, and kids, the same experience can process it differently. This tells us that all our students are going to benefit from some thoughtful reentry activities, right? And not just treat school like day one, it's just back to normal, right? We really need to reframe their COVID experience and these just accentuate positive and moving forward and not just recovery from loss. We have to reconnect them to this idea of supportive adults and peers. And really the big goal is to establish this foundation of trust and belonging and relationships, which we saw that in many rural schools, there's a good foundation to build on. Because absent that, we just can't get going. We have to sort of reconnect these connections and reestablish these relationships. But beyond that, if we go to the next slide, here's where it gets challenging. And we heard the superintendent talk about this, is that we can think of some things that are going to be good for all kids because they all experience COVID, they all experience remote learning, they all experience interrupted learning. But back to this thing of different kids experience it differently and different kids can experience the same thing and interpret it differently. You know, absent us knowing every single kid's story, which in some rural areas might be possible, but in most cases won't be, right? We're not going to be able to guess by looking at kids where they're coming from and what their experiences are. We really need a means to figure out which students need supports and what supports and when. And this is what really gets us to the meat of our talk today and using early warning systems. So if we go to the next slide. So we're going to explain and talk about how early warning systems, on-track or MTS support systems can really help us deal with this challenge of we really need to support our kids, but we really have to understand what supports they need. And we can't just assume it's the same for everybody or just know by looking at them. So how do we figure this out? That's where early warning systems come in. Next slide. And what we're trying to say is that, you know, different people call these things different things, but fundamentally they share some common things. Whether you call them early warning, on track, or MTSS, we go to the next slide. All of these approaches really combine indicators of school behavior, like students' attendance, their social emotional outcomes, their course performance, with this idea of having multi-tiers of response. Some things that are whole school that we know will benefit all kids in this circumstance. Some things that are targeted at small groups of kids that share common experiences and needs. And then some things for kids that are customized to their particular circumstances. And the goal in all of this work is to be strategic, right? Trying to get to that level where the greatest number of people are positively impacted, right? It's not saying that every kid is going to need an individual solution. It's saying some kids can just the whole school supports will be enough. For other kids, it's that plus a group experience. And for some kids, it's all that plus individual. So next slide. And then the other feature of all of these systems is they really combine real-time or near-time real data with human insight. So it's not just as important it is to have data on what the kid's attendance is, their social emotional state, their current success in school. The data is only a signal, right? To know what to do with it, we need human insights. And this is where relationships and knowing our kids is so central. We have to really access the insights from the adults, peers, and parents who have positive relationships to know the circumstances and the background that help understand the data, which then let us figure out what to do. And we need both those, right? Because if we just know the stories, sometimes we miss things the data would show us. And if we just have the data, we don't know the stories that let us figure out what to do with that data. So all of these systems, when they work well, really combine access to real-time or near-time data on key behavior indicators with systems that let us access human insights. Okay. All right, so then what do we have to do? Because many folks have an early warning system or an MTS system or an on-track system. How do we adapt this to COVID? What do we have to do to take what we have and tweak it a little bit so it really addresses the current place we're in? And that's what we're going to spend most of our time on now. Okay, next slide. So one thing that's going to be a change for some folks, I think, is that, again, for good or bad, COVID was experienced by all our students. When traditional early warning, on-track, and MTS is basically the idea there's a subset of students that need additional supports. And these systems help us figure out who those kids are and what they need. And in many cases, when a school is relatively small or that level of student need is relatively modest, these systems are operated often by a counselor and a small student support team. That's good for that situation, but that's not going to be probably sufficient for COVID, where potentially all kids are going to need some type of support. And it's going to be evolving throughout the year too, right? Because maybe they were okay in round one, but in round two, something happens, right? And so we need a way to be tracking all our kids and then responding to them. So that's going to really probably involve a greater number of adults in the school working on this together than has traditionally been the case in some places where there's been sort of modest need or relatively small size. Okay. Next slide. And then the next area of significant tweaking is going to be on the indicators themselves. All right, so if we go to the next slide. Traditionally in these systems, it's been the ABCs: attendance, behavior, / social emotional, and course performance. And the evidence has been showing that if we know our kids are coming to school, they're being able to focus in class, they're being able to get their work done, that they're going to be on track for high school graduation and post-secondary success. And this has been shown again and again to be the most critical indicators. That's great, but again, COVID spins things up a little bit and you know, shifts the environment. So we have to think through what adaptations we need to make. Let's explore these one at a time. So next slide. All right, we can go to the next one. Sorry, one more. So attendance, right? This is the mainstay of traditional early warning systems, but what's attendance when schooling is remote? What's attendance when schooling is blended? 2 days in school, 2 days out of school. And so really what we're arguing is the first thing we have to do and monitor is ask this question, do students have access to learning opportunities? Whether it's remote, in person, or blended, are they coming to school? Are they establishing online connections? Are they obtaining remote learning materials? And we further argue that the most important group to identify here is those students who have minimal or no school interaction, who are not able to get online, who have picked up remote materials but have not returned them, who on the 2 days school is open is able to come one of those 2 days, and is not then right. And we really have to, often cases, leverage social networks to find who those kids were that didn't have that, and to prioritize reconnecting with them if they come back to school, and to keep tracking this. So if we go to the next slide, the next thing of that, after we answer that most basic question, they have access to learning opportunities. Do they have the opportunity to learn whatever their circumstances are? The next thing we have to think about is that COVID-19 has really shifted more of the organization of the learning experience to the individual and family. And that argues the most important metric then is participation in learning activities. And we argue the best way to measure that perhaps is assignment and schoolwork completion, right? So, right, the fundamental measure of attendance under COVID then might be, are you able to get your work done, whatever environment you're in, as much as are you just somehow physically attending? Have you logged into the Zoom? You know, have you picked up? That shows you at least have the potential to learn, and that's the first thing. But after that potential, the question is, are you able to do the work? And if we go to the next slide, again, and this again is, just an opening idea for people to sort of improve upon and tweak and make sense to work for them. But if we focus on levels of participation, it's possible we could create sort of minimal, moderate, full categories, right? Which might correspond to good attendance, yellow flag, and like red, we got to do something with attendance. So if students are missing multiple assignments from multiple teachers or subjects, I would argue that's a red flag about their ability to participate in learning. If a student is missing some assignments from some teachers or subjects, that's, again, we should look into that, right? It could just be that they're working through some issues or they're not connecting with one teacher. And then finally, if students are completing all or nearly all their work, then we know that they are, in a sense, attending, I would argue. Typically the challenge is going to be is this information is compartmentalized in teachers' grade books. Places that have electronic grade books, which is more and more I know, may be able to tweak those to sort of get more easy aggregation happening without having to do a lot of work. But it's possible we may have to just use things like Google Docs and spreadsheets and with weekly input, especially in the cases where kids are shifting in and out of school, to be able to get a continuous tracking of, are they getting their work in? All right, next slide. And a great source for this, and I'm sure many of you have found it, is Attendance Works. And they have a rich set of attendance tools, but they have some specific ideas for how you could address absenteeism and learning participation during COVID. Okay. Next slide. All right, so that's how do we rethink attendance maybe around, first, do you have the opportunity to learn, and then are you actually able to complete assignments? For behavior and social emotional, we argue the first thing is really this idea of well-being, right? That's really critical. If fundamentally, if a student can't say I'm okay, like it's going to be hard to get anything else done. And so really this precondition for productive behavior is really a sense of safety, and environment supportive of managing stress brought on by both the economic and social impacts and medical impacts of COVID. And here's again, really where again, I really think we're gonna have to call upon some of the surveys that are out there, and many groups are putting out surveys that are more COVID tailored. Many groups are putting out free surveys. I found if you just search student well-being surveys, a lot of options will pop up, because really without asking kids, it's gonna be hard to know. And this is gonna be a change. I mean, many schools they're used to maybe a yearly climate survey, but this is a much more proactive upfront. And the idea, you can often create just short surveys so you can give them multiple times, right? To sort of just, 10 well-being questions, right? That you can ask and sort of see how are our kids doing. All right, next slide. And again, here are some good resources. And again, we'll give a master link at the end that will take you to where you can actually get these. But there's some actually nice stuff from the Child Traumatic Stress Network on actually how to talk to students about the economic impacts of COVID. Because we know in many cases that's going to be as profound for some as the actual medical ones. Next slide. And then the second piece of behavior, social, emotional, we argue, after well-being is this sense of connectedness. And there's actually some really powerful research here from the public health field, of all places, that says that when students feel connected to school, it is the strongest sort of proactive thing for a whole host of sort of things we don't want to happen. And what's powerful is that they've been actually able to quantify this in a way that's really measurable for schools. And what they say is it's, to have actually 2 or more adults whose students believe in them as a person and care about them as a person. And again, we heard that rural schools might have some good foundation to build upon here. I know many of us have been drilled in just one, every kid needs a person. That's true. That's a baseline. That's like table stakes. But the actual research says when it gets to 2, it's even more stronger, because then the kids feel like there's a group, they're part of they're connected to something, not just to a person. Another key thing is they feel affiliated with a peer group that's supportive of their identity. That can be both formal and informal peer groups. And it's an interesting thing, that's one of the things we might think to let slide right now. Like, we got to get kids learning, we got to get them healthy, We got to get them safe. You know, we got to get them in school. But in talking to kids and many kids surveys, those peer groups are essential, right? And to figure out even remotely how to keep some of that going is worth the effort. And that's really related to the second one. The third key thing they found is actually engagement in pro-social activities, helping others directly or indirectly. And again, sometimes we for teenagers, we don't, we think they're sort of self-absorbed, and a subset of kids are like highly engaged in volunteering. But it really turns out that all kids benefit from pro-social activities. And there's actually good research that shows they actually work harder in their schoolwork when they think it's doing something for somebody else and not just them. If that connection could be made. So of course, lots of people need lots of help right now. And this even gets back to our earlier thing of some kids feeling agency under COVID, because now they're actually helping people. So again, keeping ways to keep that going in school and in its different conditions are important. And then the final thing, of course, is that they feel schooling is a welcoming place. It seems obvious to us, but again, we need to remind ourselves there is a subset of kids that do not find school welcoming. They feel like they're outsiders. They feel like the system is unfair to them. They feel all kinds of host of things that don't make them feel welcome there. So, and again, that's a thing that a quick survey can often give you a quick read on. And that we have a nice resource at the end about how to build connection when schooling is remote that you can check out. All right, we're ready to move on. Course performance. All right, we got the A and we got the B. Course performance, for those that know the literature know that is the single strongest indicator of like both high school graduation and college success. If you get failing grades, your odds of graduating high school are very low. If you get decent grades in challenging courses, your odds of college and post-secondary success are very high. Nothing else swings your odds as great as your grades. Which is really interesting under COVID, right? Because many places went to pass fail or hold harmless as they had to, because kids, it happened so quickly, and it really wasn't really understanding ways to sort of to keep it going. But it is the thing that we're going to have to pay attention to. One nice resource is from Turnaround for Children, and this will be linked, and they really stress the idea of supportive learning environments that are based on relationships, routines, and resilience. The routines one is interesting, given that we know that many of our proposed solutions for next year involve ever-changing routines. Some days in school, some days out, some age kids here, some age kids there. It's going to be a lot to process, and it's reality. We'll have to find a way through it. But the evidence is clear that our brains are prediction machines, and that order and knowing what's coming next is what keeps them calm and lets them able to learn. So we do have to think, even in sort of this chaos, how we build routine. Next slide. And again, some links to those resources. Next slide. And another nice, clear set of guidelines for sort of engaged classrooms comes from a group at Stanford called PERTS. And they identify really academic engagement as teacher caring, feedback for growth, and meaningful work. And they also have a free set of survey items, 3 questions for each of these. So you can sort of almost on a monthly basis give these questions and seeing, are students feeling more or less teacher caring under these conditions? Are they getting feedback? How does it change under these conditions? Do they see the work as meaningful? So those 2 ideas together are really a ways, this idea we need to focus on learning environments is like the precondition for grades, if you will. And then on to the next slide. And again, where you could find those, and we'll have a meta link at the end. Next slide. And where I want us to leave us on grades is back to really high school grades and course credit, right? As we know, many places sort of had to waive this at the end of last year. This year, the indication is that people are going to try to find ways to get closer to normal practice. We'll see how that goes. And just remind ourselves this idea of decent grades and challenging classes remains a critical outcome. So how under COVID can we keep our high school kids getting access to challenging work regardless of how it's done. And how can we find a way to sort of fairly assess that? That's pays attention to the circumstances. We need to do that. But also make sure kids are getting actual feedback and actual benchmarking of how they're doing. And there is a growing number of folks that have been working on things like portfolios and projects, competency-based models under COVID, how they can be adapted under COVID to help supplement some of that traditional grading practices that are challenging to do when you're not in a face-to-face environment. So really what this tells us, and again, it's really hard to add anything more to teachers' plates because they're really overwhelming and we recognize that. But somehow high schools do have to figure out how to sort of keep giving feedback and benchmarks for what quality work is and helping kids create conditions in which they can still do that quality work regardless of the learning circumstances they find it. It's much easier said than done, but we just felt it's important to remind ourselves that we still have to figure that out. All right, next slide. So that's part B. How do we modify our ADC indicators? And then I'm going to have a final quick part C, and then we'll open it up for some questions and answers. All right, so the next question is, back to my original challenge of if we have to say we sort of have to expand these systems in many cases to cover all kids, how are we going to organize the adequate resources to do this school-wide, to progress monitor students on these adapted ABC indicators and be responsive and adaptive as needs evolve? Because that's the challenge we face, right, in a long sentence. So what are some of how do we put some of those pieces together is some of the final things we want to share. So next slide. So a critical thing will be figuring out how we can organize teams of adults with subsets of students they know. Really, right, this idea of that we've got to get many of the adults in the school involved in these processes. It only really makes sense when you can get a group of adults that share a common set of kids together to share their insights and to remind ourselves that we want to go wide here, right? Not saying that these folks have to come to every meeting, but if a given kid is sort of being discussed or figured out or tried to be supported, you can bring in a larger expanse of folks who know that kid. So that includes coaches and counselors and nonprofit partners who work in the school as part of this extended team. And how do we sort of like bring everybody together? And then we have to provide time in the schedule for this to happen. We really argue this is really fundamental work in general, but in particular during COVID. It's hard to imagine how we can have adaptive responses to COVID if we're not progress monitoring kids on key indicators, looking at the trends and patterns, figuring out multi-tiered solutions, monitoring them and adapting them as necessary. It's hard to imagine how we can be responsive absent some sort of system like that. And we need to recognize that will take time in the schedule. That's something that has to be built in and sort of valued. Next slide. Analyze means to analyze the impact and support provided and make adjustments as needed, right? There's no playbook on COVID, right? And one of the steps that's often overlooked in traditional use of these systems, and it's more critical than ever, is actually recording what the intervention is we decided to do, whether it be at a whole school level or a group level or a student level. The human response to this work, because we're all at some level always working under some level of stress and scarcity in our schools, is to say, once we got to figure it out, we're good to go. Like people will do what they were supposed to do or said they would do or able to do, and it'll get done and it'll have impact. But as we know, stuff happens. And if we don't take that extra 30 seconds to record what we decided to do, we won't be able to go back and see if that actually happened, and if it did happen, if it was effective. And if we weren't able to do it or it wasn't effective, that tells us we have to try something else. So that's just really a reminder that this has always been part of early warning systems, but it's the part that usually gets skipped. But what we're trying to tell people is under COVID, it's even more important than ever not to skip this step. Next slide. It's important to see students as co-designers of this work. At all ages, but particularly middle and high school adolescents. We really have to, the only way to know what they experience is to ask them, right? And first we have to sort of build that trust. And we said maybe this rural schools have a starting point here. So students believe this is all being done for them and that we're in their corner. It's not a gotcha. It's not you're in trouble. It's not that something bad happened to you or blaming you. So if we have that precondition, then we can really put them at the center of this work, really, and help them figure out what they think they need to be able to succeed. And there's, again, we'll share this after. There's a couple of very nice student voice pieces that have come out recently about student views of how to respond to COVID. Okay. Next slide. And we have to, finally remind ourselves to always be culturally and situationally responsive. How students and their families experience COVID might be different from how the school staff experience them. In some cases, we heard the school staff lives right in the community and they'll be more similar. In other cases, the school staff doesn't live in the community and they can be quite different. We also know there are structural inequities in access to healthcare, Wi-Fi, food, medicine, all the basics of life, right? We do not equally distribute in our society. And so we have to be cognizant of how that plays out in these, what's possible and what is needed. And really prior work has shown that when we're trying to be culturally and situationally responsive, some key things are to really take this, sense of empathy, absence of blame, seeking to listen and understand, having a shared sense of humanity, and this idea of practical support without pity is really what, again, when they've asked folks that are in these situations how what they take as being more or less responsive to their needs, this is what we hear. All right, we're almost there. Next slide. And so this is the final slide. This is one we said we went back and forth if we should actually put it out there or not. And we put it out there very much as a work in progress, a straw person to generate debate, to say if we were to take often this standard model of early warning systems where you have your indicators up top and your tiers going down the side, what might it look like in a COVID adapted world? And this really just provides a summary of what we talked about in the thing, this idea that attendance is about, are you actually able to participate? And then did you get your assignments done? For behavior, what's your sense of well-being? And then what's your sense of connection? For classroom environments, do we have strong learning environments? And then how are we sort of dealing with high school grades? And then a post-secondary column about do students see that there's still a path for a future? And then more importantly, are we still making sure those important milestones are happening? And my very last comment, and just I want to save less time for thing, is because I know we have a lot of college access and other related folks on the call. As you know, right, so many kids are dependent on the cycles of school support to sort of do that nagging and nurturing to make sure all those deadlines and all those milestones get met. And that many of our kids were cut off from that, who are seniors this year, and we still have to find ways to reach out to them, even though they're formally out of the school system, but still see them as part of, for those kids that didn't get that support, how to keep giving it. And then for this year's rising seniors, to really pay attention up front. And in many ways, while we have them, try to fast forward as much of this as we can, because we can't predict what's going to happen, and we don't want to get caught again where kids are just sort of left adrift at the most critical time. And with that, I think our presentation comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing it with you, and we'll share these resources and the ones we mentioned. And I think we have some time for some Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. And I have to say, I have a whole list of action items that I hadn't thought about. So this is such good practical thoughts. We did have a few questions that came up. One, when we think about the teacher teams, what role have you seen professional learning communities play? Do you think there is a role for PLCs? Yeah,
absolutely. The trick to do here is build upon the structures you have. Right, it's going to be hard to build a new structure from scratch under the current environment, although sometimes opportunities come from chaos, so maybe, but in general, build from the structures you have. So if you have a PLC, think about how how that can be a core, and then how you can bring other people in that know the kids that aren't part of that PLC.
And then thinking about that piece of it, in rural schools, particularly our small rural school districts, many of them are financially strapped, and the folks in the schools already wear so many different hats.
Yeah.
So for schools that don't have an early warning system or developed yet, any resources or opportunities or ways that they could think about rolling this out and using this as the opportunity to actually start this work?
So the power of early warning systems is, yes, they are, you can have a lot of bells and whistles that are important. You know, a centralized data system, automatic printouts of kids and things. But fundamentally, all the data you need is at your fingertips. It's in your attendance logs, it's in your grade books, it's in your behavioral referrals, and most importantly, it's what you know about your kids. So the only cost is finding the time for the adults to share what they know. And, you know, we have to make choices. I recognize you can't do everything, but the extent that I would argue that this is a pretty important one, just because it is the means that we can sort of pool our resources to both understand what our kids need and try to find the most effective and, in a way, efficient way to provide them, because otherwise it's everyone trying to figure it out on their own, and you have a lot of hit and misses.
And I think that's real important for us as college access professionals who often work in partnership with the schools.
Right.
I find, and I've been guilty of this in the past, of going in with my agenda and not thinking about how I could align that agenda with the school's plans.
Right.
And there have been times where we've duplicated services in the past. So I think you're right, is working, especially with those of us that partner with small rural schools, listening and working with the school to ensure that we're pulling in the same direction, we're using the same data.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about I always say one caring adult. So now you've challenged me and I'm going to say two or more caring adults. Our next month, our conversation is really going to revolve around how AmeriCorps can be used to move educational outcomes. Is there a connection, and have you seen success where folks use AmeriCorps members in early warning systems?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great resource, and at multiple levels. I did an op-ed on this, saying that there is 3 big COVID concern areas, and each one of them can benefit from AmeriCorps person power. One is sort of tutoring to recover learning, because we know that actually direct one-on-one tutoring is the most powerful and efficient means to close learning gaps. 2 is this early warning and keeping kids on track and building relationships. And then 3 is the college access piece. It's helping them make sure all those key milestones, all those benefit from person power that can be supplied by AmeriCorps.
And one of the things that we're realizing too is we have to stay on top of policies and funding that's coming through COVID. And I know there's some funding pending now, the CORE Act, that would actually put additional new dollars into AmeriCorps members. So one of the reasons we wanted to talk about AmeriCorps next month is that would give folks time to actually think about designing and applying for AmeriCorps dollars this year. And we're hoping more dollars will be there, because I do think that it's an untapped resource in a lot of rural communities. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And also, the thing is that the idea of like some of those seniors that got caught last year without a post-secondary placement, this is a very nice avenue for that, for both to get the idea of like giving back to others gives us agency, but you can then also work with them to find a placement, because they're now within, the biggest concern is that if you are a young adult and you are without an institution, it's hard to bring you back. If you left the K-12 system and you haven't joined the higher ed system, you're not affiliated with any institution, you're on your own. So AmeriCorps could be a nice bridge for those students too.
And I'm glad you said that, because I know that, for upper middle income folks, gap years work and they're a possibility because parents underwrite a year of study and a year of finding yourself. But we know for low income kids that a gap year can be detrimental because you become totally disconnected. So I'm right there with you. AmeriCorps can actually be a great way to do a gap year of service, especially with the CORE Act. They're wanting to double the living stipend, right? So maybe we can actually make service work for young people. Anything else you want to add? I know there's more questions. I guess the other question, one more question, families, right? So we also have to be supporting families. Is there anybody doing great work there that we should look at their work on how families are being supported during COVID to support their children academically?
I don't know about like examples of this place, but I do know, and this has been very interesting, like observation, is that schools pre-COVID that were more relationship-based and more design-based have been able to be more nimble than those that were more based on sort of just like rules, regulations, standard procedures. But what those folks found that were that more nimble thing is that they did have to build capacities or partnerships to meet family need because they had relationships, they got a deeper understanding into family need than some of the other schools that were more just, you know, you're impersonal, so we don't know your story. So they were then saying that, not that they complain anyway, that they embraced it, but it required them to even build more capacity because they became more aware of need because they had stronger relationships. And, you know, in many ways, the school is the only functioning social institution in many of these neighborhoods. So it has to take on, whether you're officially a community school or not, you become a community school.
Yeah, and I always say that the majority of our rural schools, if they're doing good work, they are community schools. Right. And they really were community schools before it became coined as a term, community schools. Yeah. So thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. We will be sharing Bob's contact information. We'll be sharing the presentation out. I do want to encourage you to join us next month for our conversation. And Sam has a slide that has that date. Daryl Lester, he's at North Carolina State, and he's Director of Service Years for North Carolina State. We'll talk about how they have done and are using AmeriCorps Cradle to Career to move outcomes. And Rosa Marino, worked with CNCS, and she's been with Service Year Alliance, and she's going to talk about the real practical aspects of what it would take to actually run and develop a proposal for AmeriCorps. So it's really a step into thinking about how AmeriCorps can move outcomes cradle to career.
And Dreama, I just want to add one thing, because I didn't show the last slide, is that the all of the various things we referred to in the deck as like this resource, that resource, if folks just go to Pathways to Adult Success COVID resources, Pathways to Adult Success COVID resources, it will take them to a series of webinars we did, including a version of this one, and there they will find directly linked all of the resources we mentioned today.
And that's how I found you for this presentation, right? I've done your work, but I saw that presentation. I was like, we need to do one with this rule frame. So we will be sending out the link with it by the end of the week to this presentation that also has the link to the resources. And then we hope you join us next month. So any final thoughts, guys, before we end? No?
All right.
People are saying great session. Thanks so much,
Thank
Bob.
you. Thanks, everyone. It's my pleasure.